Hi, I don't want to talk about fracking. I've talked about fracking for 5 years. But you know, there's a parallel story, and it's a story full of contrasts. It's full of the contrasts of the bitter, twisted lies we're told by our government through the media. It's full of the lies that we're told by this industry and the false promises they make. The contrasts with the beautiful, warm humanity that we have when we find each other in this movement. And it's a contrast with the raw truth, the painful, emotional truth of people like George Bender, who took his life in Australia because he couldn't carry on the fight. He was a farmer, and when he lost his 1,000th pig, and when his family had to move away, everything that he fought for all his life, he had to sacrifice, and he couldn't do it. So one day he took the poison, and within a second of taking it, he rushed to his daughter and said, "I've done something very stupid. It was a moment of weakness." But there are people across the world who are already living life in gas fields, who are already suffering the consequences and watching their children get sick. And it's those voices that we've heard. And you can choose to read a report or listen to what the government tells you, but until you look someone in the eye who's actually living it and breathing it, that's where you find your truth. And we found our truth in each other. And I get to be I Am Tina Rothery because I'm being persecuted by this industry. But it could easily be you, and it isn't heroic. It's not heroic at all. I think, like everybody here, we're not in this out of choice. We are in this out of obligation to our children and their children. When you are defending your young, at what point do you switch that job off? At what point do you look at your government and go, do you know what? I reckon Cameron's all right, really. And Theresa May, what a frigging godsend. You know, that woman, I can tell, she cares. She cares about my granddaughter. I can see it in her eyes as she granted the last fracking license. So when you are protecting your young, and they say to you, and I gave evidence in the House of Lords with the first group that I was with, one of the very early groups, Residents' Action on Violent Fracking, who, amongst others, were some of the early alerts for our country. We gave evidence in the House of Lords in 2012, and I remember Lord Lawson said to me, "What will it take, Tina, to make you stop?" And I was like, "Was this why we're here? To find out how to make a movement stop growing. Not how to find out, is this industry safe and good for our communities and our children and our futures?" But this parallel story is our story, because I used to give, when we was first giving public talks, I used to leave after every one and feel so awful, because I called it the unwelcome gift of truth. Because when you found out about fracking and the risks it could pose, how did you unknow that? How do you can't unknow this. And then every exit door has your child or your grandchild's face on it that says, you're going to walk away from this? Because you're not just walking away from the legacy of the toxic waste or the risks of seismic activity or the fact that we know we're not stupid. We know that none of these companies is coming back 10, 20, 30 years later to check the integrity of what they left behind. They say they leave it as they found it. No, they didn't. There's a hole. There's a whopping great hole, and they filled it with cement that will deteriorate over time, and the steel will perish. And then what happens to the waste that was left under there? Who deals with that when it comes up into your agriculture and your groundwater and your aquifers? But we don't just leave our children that. If we do not succeed in keeping Britain frack free, we leave our children a legacy that says this is not a democracy. Your voice does not count. And the fight that we've had for the last 5 years, that even though you say it's tireless, no, it's bloody exhausting. After the last 5 years, that means that we leave them this fight, but twice as hard because they won. And we cannot let that happen. We cannot. Because it's not just this. And with this unwelcome truth that we find, it's the awareness that our government believes that this gamble is a gamble worth taking. That it doesn't matter, it's worth a risk. So what if you give birth to a child prematurely and there's some risk in his life? Maybe they balance that against what it would do for our economy. But not one of us here lives in an economy. We live in a family, a community, a society. We live in neighborhoods. Beauty and the solidarity and the minor miracles we find along the way as we find ourselves activists, when most of us never imagined this would be our lives. And when you find those unwelcome truths that your government is willing to take these chances with you, there is a beauty in the person standing next to you that gives a damn. And how often before you became an activist, and we all weren't one once, did you stand next to someone who you were certain gave a damn, got off their ass and got out in the streets and made a difference? And that's what everyone in this movement does. We've gone from 3 groups in 2011 to over 500 groups across the country now. This industry promised, and I've watched them promise it at countless meetings, that they would be in full production next year. They'll be in full production next year. Hey, it's 2016, no one's in production. They granted a well here because it was a pushover with a council that was made up of Conservatives and a pre-existing old well site that did, traditional drilling. So that was a walkover. Has anyone moved the drill? Mm-mm. Everyone knows whoever takes the next step will have the full force of a full anti-fracking movement to contend with. And no one wants to be the first guy. So, you might not think that the person standing next to you looks very scary, but I will say that when we form like a murmuration of birds does, then you know that we are a mass to be reckoned with. And I may be Tina Rothery, but I'm only the result of Vanessa Vine, Atlanta Cook, Residents Action on Anti-Fracking, Ian Crane, Julie Wassmer, everybody across the country who took the time out. I just happen to be the one who usually grabs a microphone, and I happen to be being sued for $55,000. But really, this could be your gift too. So, anyway.